In the heart of the great white winter, when the world was reduced to wind and ice, two cabins stood as a testament to two different truths. The first was a glittering palace of frost, its log walls sheathed in a thick, crystalline armor that caught the pale moonlight and fractured it into 1,000 cold shards. It groaned under the weight of its own beauty, a sound like a dying beast, as the ice worked its way deeper into the wood. The second cabin, less than 100 paces away, was a shadow. Its walls were a flat, matte black, a void in the snow-swept landscape. The wind-driven snow did not cling to it, but slid from its surfaces, leaving the dark logs bare. One cabin was a monument to the brutal, accepted reality of the frontier. The other was a quiet, stubborn refusal. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories of quiet innovation and forgotten genius resonate with you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's tale is even more compelling. 2 years earlier, Caleb had lived in a house of ice. It was not a choice, but a condition of the land, a hardship that every settler accepted as they accepted the rising of the sun and the biting of the frost. His wife, Hannah, had called it the weeping wall. In the deepest cold of January, the interior logs behind their bed would begin to sweat a cold dew. The moisture, born from their own breath and the steam of the kettle, would seep into the wood, drawn by the incredible cold outside. It would freeze inside the fibers of the timber, and a delicate fern-like pattern of frost would bloom on the wall. At first, it was a thing of strange beauty. But the beauty soured as the frost grew thicker, coalescing into a solid sheet of ice that was cold to the touch even from a foot away. The cold seemed to radiate from it, a living presence in their small home. It stole the heat from the stove and the warmth from their bodies. Hannah developed a cough, a dry, rasping thing that worsened as the winter deepened. The damp coldness of the cabin settled in her lungs, a permanent winter she could not escape. Caleb split more wood, kept the fire roaring until the stovepipe glowed a dull cherry red, but the wall of ice remained. He remembered the awful, intimate labor of it. He would take his hatchet and carefully chip the ice from the inside of his own home, the sharp cracks echoing in the small space. Shards of it would fall onto their bed, onto the floor, melting into grim puddles of water that had to be mopped up before they too could freeze. He was fighting a battle against his own shelter. The very walls meant to protect them were conduits for the cold that was killing his wife. She passed in early March, just as the first thaw was beginning to weep down the outside of the cabin, her last breaths shallow clouds in the frigid air. The failure was not an accident of nature, it was a defect in design. Caleb understood this with a clarity that felt like a hot stone in his gut. The logs, for all their thickness and strength, were porous. They were like hard sponges. The warmth from inside the cabin pushed moisture into the wood, and the brutal cold from outside pulled it through. Deep within the heart of each log, where the temperature dropped below freezing, that moisture turned to ice. Water expanded when it froze, a simple, powerful law of physics. It was a law that could split granite and shatter iron. Inside the wood, millions of tiny ice crystals were expanding, pushing the fibers of the logs apart, creating microscopic fissures and cracks. This process, slow and relentless, was called frost wedging. It not only damaged the structure over time, turning sound timber into a soft, punky mass, but it also made the walls catastrophically inefficient. The ice acted as a bridge, a conductor, pulling the precious heat from inside the cabin and bleeding it out into the frozen world. The chinking, the mud and moss mixture stuffed between the logs, was even more susceptible. It would become saturated with moisture, freeze solid, and then crumble away, opening gaps for the wind to knife through. Every settler knew this. They accepted it. They stuffed rags in the gaps, nailed hides over the worst spots, and burned mountains of wood just to stay alive. They treated the symptom, never the cause. After Hannah's death, Caleb's grief curdled into a cold, focused anger. It was not an anger directed at God or at the harshness of the land. It was a precise, analytical rage aimed at the simple log. He looked at his home, the structure that should have been a sanctuary, and saw it as a flawed machine, an enemy. The conventional wisdom that said, "This is just how it is," became an insult to Hannah's memory. He rejected it completely. The problem was not inevitable, it was unsolved. And in the lonely quiet of his cabin, surrounded by the ghosts of a shared warmth, he became obsessed with solving it. His trapping lines, once his livelihood, fell into neglect. The beaver and muskrat went undisturbed as Caleb dedicated his days to observation. He would stand for hours in the snow, simply staring at his cabin, then at his neighbors. He watched how the sun melted the frost on the south-facing walls and how the shadows on the north side held the ice long into the day. He touched the walls, feeling the deep, penetrating cold that seemed to emanate from the wood itself. He chipped away at the ice, examining its thickness, its clarity, the way it bonded to the timber. He became a student of failure. His isolation from the community grew, not from malice, but from a singular, consuming focus. The usual patterns of frontier life, the communal hunts, the Sunday gatherings, the shared labor of the harvest, all faded into the background. His world shrank to the space between the logs, to the crystalline structure of ice, to the subtle transfer of heat and cold. The other settlers began to whisper. They saw his neglect of his duties, his strange, silent vigils in the cold. They attributed it to grief, a mind unmoored by loss. They left him alone, a sad, strange man lost in his own world. His research became more active. He walked for 2 days to an old abandoned trading post that had stood for 50 years. The roof had collapsed and the floors were rotten, but the lower logs, the ones closest to the ground, were different. They were blackened and hard, coated in decades of pine tar applied to fight off rot. He noticed that these logs, even in their state of decay, seemed less fractured, less splintered than the untreated logs higher up. The tar had created a skin, a barrier. It was a clue. The solution had to be external, a shield applied to the outside of the wall. He then sought out the people on the fringes of the settlement, those whose knowledge was specialized and often overlooked. He spent a day with the blacksmith, asking not about metal, but about heat. He learned how the man used a slurry of clay and ash to insulate parts of his forge, to direct and control the intense temperatures. The ash, the smith explained, was full of air pockets, and it did not burn. It was a poor conductor of heat, another clue. His most important visit was to Samuel, an old tanner and soap maker who lived a mile upstream in a cabin perpetually shrouded in a haze of wood smoke and the pungent chemical smell of his trade. Samuel was a master of a messy, odorous alchemy, transforming animal hides and fats into leather and lye soap. His smokehouse was a small, windowless shed, its interior walls coated with a thick, greasy layer of soot from years of curing meat. Caleb ran a hand over the surface. It was slick, almost oily, and it repelled the moisture in the air. He asked Samuel about fat. The old man, happy for the company, spoke for hours about the properties of tallow, the hard, white fat rendered from suet. "It's the best for candles because it burns clean," Samuel explained. "But it's also the best for waterproofing. Work it into your boots, and you can stand in a creek all day and your feet will stay dry as dust." He showed Caleb a pair of hardened leather gaiters that were stiff and dark with years of tallow application. Water beaded on them like mercury. Caleb listened, his mind working, connecting the disparate pieces of information. The pine tar of the trading post, the insulating ash from the blacksmith's forge, the waterproof tallow from the tanner's boots. And then Samuel said something that locked everything into place. While explaining how to make lye for soap, he gestured to a barrel of wood ash. "The ash is the key," he said. "It pulls the caustic salts out, but it's also a powerful drying agent. We use it to clean up spills. It just drinks moisture right up." That was it. The eureka moment was not a flash of lightning, but the quiet, solid click of a lock tumbler falling into place. It was a paradigm shift. He didn't need to fight the ice. He needed to deny it the one thing it required to exist: water. If he could create a barrier on the outside of the logs that was both waterproof and moisture absorbent, he could stop the process before it ever began. The fat would create a hydrophobic seal, preventing liquid water from soaking into the wood. The ash, mixed into the fat, would act as a desiccant, absorbing any ambient moisture on the surface, and it would add body and durability to the coating. It would be a skin for his house, one that could breathe yet remain impenetrable. He returned to his cabin with a fervent, almost holy purpose. The time for observation was over. The time for labor had begun. His plan was simple in concept, but massive in scale. He needed vast quantities of 2 simple, messy ingredients: animal fat and wood ash. He spent the last days of summer gathering his materials. He emptied the ash bin of his stove every morning, carefully sifting it through a fine screen to remove any charcoal, storing the resulting gray powder in dry barrels. The fat was a greater challenge. He went to the settlement's butcher and traded his best furs, the ones he had managed to collect in his few distracted trips to his trap lines. He didn't trade for meat or supplies, but for barrels of suet, the hard, raw fat from around the kidneys and loins of cattle and deer. The butcher thought him mad. Marcus, his nearest neighbor and the self-appointed voice of the community's conventional wisdom, saw the transaction. He watched as Caleb hauled the bloody, reeking barrels back to his cabin on a handcart. The sight confirmed for everyone that Caleb's grief had finally broken his mind. Who would trade a prime silver fox pelt for a barrel of guts and waste? As autumn painted the hills in shades of fire, Caleb began his work. He built a large fire pit a safe distance from his cabin and placed a massive iron cauldron, borrowed from the soapmaker Samuel, over the flames. Into the cauldron went the suet, great chunks of white and pink fat that sizzled and began to melt. His son, Daniel, a quiet boy of 12 who had inherited his father's methodical nature, stood with him. The boy had watched his mother fade and die in the cold cabin, and he understood his father's obsession in a way no one else could. He needed no explanation. He simply picked up a long wooden paddle and began to stir the rendering fat. The process consumed them. For weeks, their small clearing was filled with the thick, cloying smell of boiling fat. It was a smell that clung to their clothes and hair, a smell that drew flies during the day and curious predators at night. The liquid tallow, once rendered and skimmed of impurities, was a clear, golden fluid that cooled into a hard, creamy white wax. They filled bucket after bucket with it, a precious, hard-won supply. The technical phase of the work was precise and unrelenting. Caleb mixed the cooled, semi-solid tallow with the fine wood ash. He experimented with the ratio, seeking a consistency that was not a liquid, but a thick, heavy paste, something like cold lard mixed with fine sand. The final mixture was a dull, lifeless gray, gritty to the touch, and still carrying the faint, waxy odor of its primary ingredient. It was profoundly ugly. Then came the application. Starting at the foundation of his cabin, Caleb and Daniel began to smear the greasy paste onto the logs. They used wooden paddles to apply it in thick layers, and their own hands to work it into every crack, every knot, every check in the wood. It was grueling, repetitive work. The paste was cool and stiff, and it took effort to force it into the grain of the timber. They worked in a slow, methodical rhythm, covering one log at a time, their hands and arms coated to the elbows in the gray, gritty substance. The community's whispers turned to open mockery. Marcus would often stand at the edge of his own property, arms crossed, a look of pity and contempt on his face. He watched Caleb and the boy laboring to cover their perfectly good log home in what looked like mud and grease. He finally broke his silence one afternoon, striding over to where Caleb was working the paste into the chinking around the window frame. "What foolishness is this, Caleb?" Marcus asked, his voice loud enough for others to hear. "Are you trying to turn your home into a stinking candle? A single stray spark from your chimney, and this whole grease pot will burn to the ground before you can get the door open." Caleb did not stop his work. He pressed a thumbful of the mixture deep into a fissure in the wood. "Tallow doesn't burn like that," he said, his voice calm and even. "It needs a wick. The wood is the wick. This will stop the water from getting to the wood. It will keep the wick dry." Marcus scoffed. "It's madness. You're defiling your own home. It looks like a plague house." He coined a name for the project that day, one that quickly spread through the settlement. He called it Caleb's Folly. The name stuck. Children would point at the strange, dark cabin. Women would avert their eyes. The men would shake their heads and speak of the sad, final decline of a once capable man. Caleb ignored them all. He and Daniel persisted, their world defined by the scent of tallow and the texture of ash. Their quiet determination was a force of nature in itself. As they worked their way up the walls, the cabin underwent a strange transformation. It ceased to look like a structure made of wood. The warm, familiar tones of the pine logs disappeared beneath the uniform, drab gray coating. It became monolithic, featureless, absorbing the autumn light rather than reflecting it. It looked alien and grim against the vibrant colors of the dying leaves. But hidden within this ugly facade was a subtle genius. Caleb was not merely painting his house with grease. He was performing a deep and penetrating treatment on the wood. The tallow, still slightly warmed by the weak autumn sun, was soaking into the outer layers of the logs, penetrating a quarter-inch deep in some places. It filled the porous channels of the wood, creating a powerful hydrophobic barrier. This was not a surface coating, it was an infusion. The ash particles suspended within the tallow played an equally crucial role. They were like a fine, durable grit. They filled the microscopic imperfections on the surface of the logs, creating an even more impenetrable seal. They also gave the coating a rough, matte texture, which would later prove important in breaking up the surface tension of water. And as Caleb had learned, the dark color, a side effect of the ash, would have the added benefit of absorbing more radiant heat from the sun on the rare, clear days of winter. helping to warm the walls ever so slightly. They finished the final wall as the first flurries of snow began to drift down from a leaden sky. The air had turned sharp and brittle, carrying the unmistakable scent of the coming deep cold. A sense of urgency had propelled them through the final days of their work. Now it was done. The cabin stood ready, a dark, silent sentinel waiting for the test that Caleb knew was coming. He had done everything he could. The rest was up to the physics he had so carefully studied. A week later, the first real test arrived. It was not a blizzard, but something more insidious, a classic ice-forming event. A period of deep cold was followed by a day when the temperature hovered just above freezing, bringing a miserable, persistent freezing rain. It was the kind of weather that coated every branch, every twig, every surface in a perfect, clear sheath of ice. Caleb and Daniel watched from their window. They looked first at Marcus's cabin. As the super-cooled rain hit the frigid logs of his neighbor's home, it froze instantly. A thin, transparent glaze formed, growing thicker with each passing hour. By dusk, Marcus's cabin was entombed in a half-inch of solid, clear ice. It looked beautiful and terrible, a house made of glass. Then they looked at their own walls. The effect was astonishing. The freezing rain struck the tallow and ash coating and did not freeze. The greasy, slightly rough surface did not allow the water to spread out and make contact. Instead, it beaded up, forming tiny, perfect spheres that rolled down the dark walls and dripped harmlessly to the ground. There was no sheen of ice. There was no glittering armor. The walls remained dark, wet, and completely free of frost. The true proof of concept, however, was inside. Caleb walked to the north wall, the wall behind where his bed still stood, the wall that had wept for Hannah. He placed his palm flat against the interior logs. It was cool, yes, but it was a dry, solid coolness. It was the feeling of wood, not of ice. For the first time in years, in the face of a freezing rain, there was no bloom of frost on the inside of his home. The system worked. A quiet, profound sense of relief washed over Caleb. It was not triumph, but the deep, satisfying peace of a problem correctly solved. The neighbors, however, remained unconvinced. Marcus saw the stark difference between his ice-encased home and Caleb's bare one, but he refused to see it as a success. He attributed it to something else entirely, a conclusion born of his own stubborn pride. "Look at him," Marcus declared to the others gathered at the trading post. "He's burning through his winter woodpile at a frantic pace. The only reason there's no ice on his walls is because he's keeping that grease pot so hot from the inside that it melts as soon as it forms. He's a fool. He'll be out of firewood by February and will freeze to death in that stinking house." This explanation was easier for the community to accept than the idea that Caleb, in his grief-stricken madness, had actually accomplished something revolutionary. They saw the lack of ice not as a sign of brilliant innovation, but as further proof of his foolishness and wastefulness. The dark cabin, glowing with a steady warmth, became an object of pity, a symbol of a man burning through his resources in a desperate, pointless fight against the inevitable. Their skepticism was a wall far more impenetrable than the one Caleb had built. The true test, the one that would validate his work beyond all doubt, came in the dead heart of January. A storm began to gather in the northwest, a mass of dark clouds that swallowed the sky. The old-timers felt a change in the air, a deep, resonant cold that went beyond the usual harshness of winter. They called it a breeder storm, one that would not pass through, but would settle in and grow, feeding on itself. They were right. The settlers would later call it the White Death. It began with a gentle snowfall that lasted for 3 days and 3 nights, burying the landscape in a thick, soft blanket 4 feet deep. Then the wind came. It howled out of the north, a relentless, scouring force that picked up the new-fallen snow and turned the world into a churning, white chaos. The temperature plummeted. It fell to levels no one had ever experienced, a cold so profound it felt like a physical weight, a pressure that could crack bone and freeze a man's soul. The blizzard had arrived, and it was a monster of legendary proportions. Inside his cabin, Caleb felt the storm, but was not threatened by it. The wind shrieked around the corners of his home, but the walls were silent. His fire burned steadily, and the warmth it produced stayed within the room, a pool of calm and safety in the midst of the gale. Daniel slept soundly in his cot, untroubled. Caleb sat at his table, listening to the storm, feeling the solid, dry walls around him, and knew that his theory was holding. His home was not fighting the winter. It was ignoring it. The narrative of the storm, however, was written differently in the other cabins of the settlement. In Marcus's home, the situation was becoming desperate. The initial snowfall had been followed by a period of sleet, which had frozen solid to his untreated logs. Now, the wind was driving snow into every tiny crevice of this ice armor, where it melted from the escaping interior heat and then refroze, adding to the ever-thickening sheath. The walls of his cabin were encased in a solid block of ice nearly a foot thick. The sheer weight of this ice was immense. It pulled at the chinking, which had already been shattered by the internal frost wedging. A bitter, needle-sharp wind now knifed through a dozen new gaps in the walls. Marcus's wife and 2 small children were huddled around the stove, wrapped in every blanket and fur they owned, but the cold was relentless. They shivered uncontrollably. The heat from their roaring fire was being stolen by the walls, sucked out into the heart of the storm as fast as it could be produced. The cabin was failing. Then came the sound. It was a sharp, explosive crack, like a rifle shot, that was audible even over the roar of the wind. It came from above. A main support beam in the roof, overburdened by the immense weight of the snow and the ice that bonded it to the structure, had fractured. The roof began to sag visibly in the middle. Another cracking sound followed, this one slower, a deep groan of tortured wood. It was going to collapse. Panic seized Marcus. His home, his shelter, had become a trap. He looked at the terrified faces of his wife and children, illuminated by the flickering firelight, and knew he had to get them out. But where could they go? The nearest neighbor was a quarter-mile away, an impossible journey in the blinding blizzard and lethal cold. Then he thought of the other cabin, the dark, strange one he had mocked. He thought of Caleb's folly. It was their only chance. He bundled his family in their outerwear, a frantic, fumbling process in the dim light. He pushed the door open against the resisting wind and snow and led them out into the maelstrom. The cold was a physical blow, stealing their breath. They stumbled through the deep, wind-scoured drifts, a desperate little line of humanity fighting against the overwhelming power of the storm. Marcus led them, his head down, navigating by pure instinct toward the faint, blurry glow of Caleb's window. When they finally collapsed against Caleb's door, they were half frozen, their faces masked in ice, their limbs numb. Caleb opened the door, and a wave of calm, steady warmth washed over them. He took them in without a word of reproach, without a hint of triumph. He simply ushered them into the safety of his home, his face a mask of quiet competence. The contrast was stunning. Marcus and his family, stepping in from the howling chaos, were shocked into silence. The air inside Caleb's cabin was not just warm, it was a comfortable, dry heat. The walls were not radiating cold. They were silent, solid, and neutral. There were no drafts. Marcus ran a trembling hand along the interior logs. They were smooth, dry, and only faintly cool to the touch. He looked at Caleb, his eyes wide with a dawning, humbling understanding. He had not been a fool. He had been a genius. The blizzard raged for 5 more days. The white death held the settlement in its grip, a siege of wind and cold that seemed endless. Caleb's cabin became a refuge, a lifeboat in the frozen sea. 2 other families, their own homes breached by the cold or damaged by the weight of the snow, made the perilous journey to his door. He took them all in. The small cabin was crowded, but it was warm, and it was safe. His stores of food were shared, his firewood burned to keep them all alive. When the storm finally broke, the sun rose on a world transformed and devastated. The settlement looked like a battlefield. Several roofs had completely collapsed. The walls of other cabins had been breached, the interiors filled with snow. It was a scene of widespread failure, and in the middle of it all, Caleb's dark, unassuming cabin stood completely untouched, a bastion of resilience that had weathered the worst the winter could offer. The vindication was absolute, silent, and irrefutable. His innovation had not just made his home more comfortable, it had saved the lives of his neighbors. In the days that followed, as the community dug out and began to assess the damage, a new reality settled in. The mockery directed at Caleb was replaced by a quiet, profound respect. The man they had dismissed as a madman had been the only one who was truly sane, the only one who had refused to accept a fatal flaw that had nearly destroyed them all. It was Marcus who made the first move. A week after the storm, his own home temporarily patched against the cold, he walked over to Caleb's cabin. He stood before the man he had ridiculed, his head bowed in a gesture of deep humility. "I was a fool, Caleb," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I was a proud and stubborn fool. What you've done here, it saved my family. Will you show me? Will you teach me how to do it?" Caleb harbored no grudges. The goal had never been to prove anyone wrong. It had been to solve a problem and prevent another tragedy like the one that had taken his wife. He agreed immediately. He shared his knowledge freely, holding nothing back. He explained the core principle of the hydrophobic desiccant barrier. He walked Marcus and the other men through the process of rendering the tallow, of sifting the ash, of mixing the paste to the correct consistency. He did not seek payment or even credit. His motivation was pure, to ensure that no other family would have to endure a winter in a weeping, freezing home. He helped his neighbors gather the materials and apply the coating. He answered their questions with patience and precision. He treated his innovation not as a secret to be guarded, but as a gift to be shared with anyone who needed it. That next autumn, a strange and wonderful transformation took place throughout the settlement. One by one, the cabins were coated in the dark protective layer. The air was once again thick with the smell of rendering fat, but this time it was not the scent of one man's folly, but of a community's shared wisdom and survival. By the first snowfall, every home stood ready for the winter, a small army of dark, resilient shelters. Caleb's folly had become the settlement's salvation. The idea began to spread. The following year, a traveling builder and trapper named Finn passed through the settlement on his way to the new territories opening up in the far north. He was immediately struck by the unusual appearance of the cabins. They were all uniformly dark, almost black, unlike any settlement he had ever seen. His initial skepticism turned to fascination as the locals told him the story of the White Death and the one cabin that had stood impervious to its fury. Finn sought out Caleb and spent a week with him, learning the technique. He was a practical man, and he recognized the simple, rugged genius of the solution. He made detailed notes, sketching diagrams of the application process and documenting the precise ratio of fat to ash. When he left, he carried with him not just the knowledge, but the proof of its effectiveness. As Finn traveled and helped build new outposts in even harsher climates, he taught the method to other settlers. But he did not call it Caleb's method or the Caleb seal. Over time, the personal connection to the innovator was lost. Finn and others gave it practical, generic names like northern proofing or the ash seal method. In some regions, it became known as the trapper's wall. The origin story faded, replaced by the simple, powerful fact that it worked. The innovation became anonymous, a piece of common-sense frontier knowledge passed from one builder to another, its genesis in one man's grief and intellect completely forgotten. Decades passed. Caleb lived a long and quiet life. He saw his son Daniel grow into a capable man and have a family of his own. He watched the settlement grow from a handful of rough cabins into a proper town with a church, a general store, and houses made of milled lumber. These new homes, with their modern insulation and vapor barriers, had no need for his greasy, old-fashioned treatment. But the original cabins, the ones that had survived the White Death, still stood. They were clustered in the old part of town, dark and solid, occupied by new families or used for storage. They were relics of a tougher time, and their dark, matte walls were a silent testament to the innovation that had allowed the settlement to endure and thrive. Caleb would sometimes walk past them, a quiet, anonymous old man, and remember the feel of the gritty paste on his hands, the smell of the rendering tallow, and the profound, silent vindication of a dry interior wall in the heart of a blizzard. He died in his sleep one autumn night, an old man whose work was done. His son carved his gravestone, a simple slab of local granite. The inscription was plain and humble, reflecting the life everyone in town knew him to have lived. Caleb, husband, father, trapper. There was no mention of his true legacy, no epitaph for the obsessive innovator who had tamed the winter wall. He was remembered as a good man, but not a great one. His greatest achievement had become so commonplace that it was no longer seen as an achievement at all. The enduring impact of his work was unmeasurable, but real. How many lives were saved from sickness born of the damp and cold? How many families were kept safe from the dangers of a collapsing roof or a freezing home? The number was unknowable, lost to the quiet passage of time. The technique he had pioneered, born from personal tragedy, had become a piece of anonymous folk wisdom, a simple, effective method that kept generations of families safe in the harshest of climates. His legacy was not in his name, but in the silent, effective performance of 1,000 dark-walled cabins scattered across the frontier. Years later, a lone traveler making his way through the far northern territories sought shelter as a winter storm gathered. From a high ridge, he looked down into a remote valley where a small cluster of homes was nestled. As the first flakes of snow began to fall, he saw their walls, dark and matte, already shedding the snow before it could cling. They were not houses of ice. He did not know the name Caleb, had never heard the story of a weeping wall or a blizzard called the White Death. But as he looked at those cabins, he recognized the side of a people who understood winter, who had learned how to build a proper shelter against the deep cold. He spurred his horse onward, toward the faint, welcoming lights that began to glow in their windows. Small points of warmth and safety held secure against the encroaching white chaos. A quiet victory repeated night after night, thanks to a forgotten genius.